The kid with the $12,000 precision rifle lowered his scope and shook his head like a man calling time of death. "Just leave that target, sir. Trust me. It's impossible. I put 40 rounds of match-grade .280 into that plate this month and I can't hit it on the swing. The chain's garbage. The wind's garbage. Save your ammo." The crowd around him murmured agreement, because the crowd always agrees with the kid holding the most expensive rifle. And then a voice from the back of the firing line, quiet and unhurried, said, "I'll give it a try, son." Everybody turned. The man who had spoken was small and thin and about 74 years old, wearing a faded olive windbreaker and a ball cap with no logo on it, and he was holding, and this was the part that made the kid actually laugh out loud before he could catch himself, a wood-stocked air rifle, a pellet gun. The kind of thing a grandpa buys to scare crows off his corn. The kid grinned at his friends. "Old-timer, I don't know what game you think we're playing here, but that's a pellet rifle, and that target is 75 yards downrange on a moving chain in a 10-mile-an-hour crosswind. You are not going to hit it." The old man did not answer. He just walked slowly toward the firing line, shouldered the pellet rifle, and lowered his right cheek onto the worn walnut stock. And what every single person on that firing line was about to witness, including one very specific older man standing in the back row who had just turned the colour of cold ash because he recognized the way those weathered hands were holding that rifle, was a kind of marksmanship that the United States government used to classify at a level most of them had never heard of. If you believe some old men are walking around with skills the world has forgotten how to measure, do me a favour right now and type the words "eyes on" down in the comments, because the next 30 seconds are about to remind everyone on that firing line what the word sniper used to actually mean. His name was Earl Cutter, and the reason he was at Ironwood long range on that cool Saturday morning in October was because his wife had been dead for 11 months and the silence in the cabin had finally gotten louder than he could stand. Earl lived alone now in a small log house he had built with his own hands in 1996 on a piece of forested ground up in the Blue Ridge, about 2 hours' drive from the range. He was 74 years old, 6 feet tall, and about 162 pounds dripping wet, with the kind of lean frame that you see on men who walked a lot of ridgelines in their younger years and never quite lost the habit of carrying nothing they did not need. His hair was white and cropped short under the ball cap. His eyes were grey and very steady, the kind of eyes that didn't blink much, the kind of eyes that a woman had once told him, a long time ago, looked like river stones. That woman had been his wife, Helen, and she had said it to him on their third date in 1973, and he had carried the compliment around in his chest for 50 years afterward, like a smooth, flat pebble he could reach for whenever the world got too loud. Helen had died the previous November. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and merciless. Earl had sat in the hospital room holding her hand for the last 4 days of her life, and then he had driven himself home, and he had not fired a rifle of any kind since that morning, because every time he picked one up his hands remembered her, and his eyes would not clear. The pellet rifle in the back of his truck on that Saturday morning was the first rifle he had touched in almost a year. He had not gone to Ironwood to shoot. He had gone there to be around the smell of gun oil and the sound of rifles in the clean mountain air, because those were the last sounds he could still bear hearing without thinking about Helen. He had no intention of stepping onto the firing line. He had no intention of letting anyone know he was even there. Nobody on that range that morning had any idea that the quiet old man in the windbreaker had once been listed in a classified Department of Defense training roster under the designation Instructor Level 4 Extended Range Precision, and that the last time he had put a round downrange in anger, he had been 742 metres from a target that no longer exists on any map. Ironwood Long Range was the kind of place that took itself seriously. It sat on a 200-acre parcel of rolling land about 40 minutes outside of a mid-sized town in western North Carolina, built into the shoulder of a low ridge, with firing positions out to 1,000 yards on the main line and a series of smaller bays cut into the terrain for tactical courses and specialty shooting. The clientele was a mix of serious long-range hobbyists, retired military men, a handful of active-duty shooters who drove up from Fort Bragg on weekends, and in the last 3 or 4 years, a growing number of young men with expensive scopes and YouTube channels who had decided that precision rifle was the new golf. The weekend crowd that Saturday was thicker than usual because there was a mild unofficial competition going on for bragging rights on a particular target that the range owner had installed about 6 months ago and had quietly started calling, in private conversation with his regulars, the Whisper. The Whisper was a 2-inch steel plate, round, about the diameter of a coffee cup lid, hanging from a 12-inch length of welded chain off a horizontal bar driven into the hillside at exactly 75 yards from the firing line. The chain was the whole joke. Any breath of wind, any vibration from a nearby rifle, any thump of boots on the range deck, and the Whisper would sway in its own private, unpredictable rhythm, the kind of rhythm that made calculated leads almost useless and demanded that the shooter read the swing itself in real time. Hitting a 2-inch plate at 75 yards with a precision rifle was not hard. Hitting the Whisper while it was swinging in a variable breeze was hard enough that exactly 4 shooters had done it since the range owner had put it up, and 3 of those 4 had done it on the 2nd or 3rd attempt, which most real marksmen considered a matter of luck rather than skill. The range owner had stopped offering a prize for hitting it, because he didn't want to give away any more ammunition cans. What every shooter on the range knew, without being told, was that the Whisper was not really about hitting a small target at a medium distance. The Whisper was about reading a moving system you did not control, and most shooters, no matter how much their rifle cost, could not read what they could not control. Austin Krieg was 26 years old, and he was, by any reasonable measure, a very good shooter. He had served 4 years as designated marksman in a line infantry company in the United States Marine Corps, had done 1 deployment, and had gotten out 18 months ago to pursue what he was now describing on his growing social media accounts as a career in precision shooting content creation. He was about 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with a well-maintained beard and a jaw that photographed well, and he had recently picked up a sponsorship from a small optics company that had given him a 15% off code he used at the end of every video. His rifle that morning was genuinely impressive, a custom-built bolt gun in .280 Ackley improved, fitted into a modular aluminum chassis that cost as much as a used sedan, topped with an optic that cost more than the rifle. Austin had been working the Whisper for about an hour when Earl Cutter first noticed him. The kid was a good shooter. Earl could see that immediately. His fundamentals were clean, good bone support, steady trigger brake, no flinch in the follow-through. But Earl could also see from the back of the firing line where he was standing quietly with a cup of vending machine coffee in his hand, that the kid was shooting the wrong problem. The kid was trying to calculate the Whisper. Earl could see him in his ballistic solver every time he came up off the scope, punching numbers, adjusting for wind from the flag on the berm, correcting his hold. But the Whisper was not a calculation problem. The Whisper was a patience problem, and Austin Krieg was many things, but patient was not one of them. Earl watched him miss 3 shots in a row, the impacts kicking up little puffs of dirt on the berm behind the plate, and he watched the kid lift his head from the scope and laugh in the self-mocking way young men laugh when they are actually genuinely frustrated, and he heard the kid say, loud enough for everyone on the line to hear, "That thing is impossible. The chain's garbage. I'm telling you boys, nobody's hitting that in these conditions. I'll put $20 on it right now, $20 to any man on this line who can hit that plate in the next 5 minutes. And then, because Austin Krieg was a kid with a growing audience and an instinct for generating content, he pulled out his phone and started recording. Earl Cutter had spent most of his professional life being a man who did not call attention to himself. He had been trained at a specific level very few Americans ever reached to understand that the worst thing a sniper could ever do was be seen. He had carried that training out of the military and into the rest of his life, and it had shaped the way he drove, the way he ordered coffee, the way he had loved his wife, and the way he had raised the one daughter they had managed to have before Helen's body had told them it was not going to be safe to try for more. Earl did not speak up in rooms. Earl did not volunteer opinions. Earl did not correct younger men when they were wrong, because he had learned a long time ago that most younger men had to be wrong in their own time before they could be right in anyone else's. And that Saturday morning at Ironwood Long Range, standing at the back of the firing line with his vending machine coffee going cold in his hand, Earl had every intention of keeping his mouth shut and walking back to his truck and driving home to his empty cabin and being the kind of old man that nobody on that range would ever remember having met. But then the kid with the expensive rifle said the word impossible. He said it twice. He said it loud. And something in the particular way the kid said it reached across 50 years and touched a nerve inside Earl Cutter that had not been touched in a very long time. Because once, in a very different country, in a very different war, Earl had been told by a senior officer that a particular target was impossible too, and Earl had taken that word personally and he had done something about it, and men had lived who would otherwise have died. And standing there in the back of the firing line at Ironwood on a cool October morning in his 74th year, Earl Cutter felt Helen's absence in his chest like a held breath, and he thought of her Riverstone compliment about his eyes, and he thought of what she would have said if she had been standing next to him right now watching that cocky kid pronounce something impossible that was not impossible. And Earl knew exactly what Helen would have said. Helen would have said, very quietly in the voice she used when she was pretending not to tell him what to do, "Earl, honey, go get your rifle." So Earl set his coffee cup down on the empty bench behind him, and he turned around and walked back across the gravel lot toward his truck. And nobody on that firing line paid him any attention at all. What Earl lifted out of the back of his Tacoma a minute and a half later was, to his own eyes, an old friend, and to the eyes of anyone who knew air rifles, a genuinely serious piece of precision equipment. It was a German-made spring-piston air rifle, wood-stocked in beech, that had been worn smooth by 5 decades of being carried in Earl's hands, fitted with a modest fixed-power scope that Earl had mounted himself and zeroed himself and never let anyone else touch. Earl had bought it in 1974 in a little gun shop in Heidelberg while he was stationed in West Germany, and he had been shooting it on and off ever since. He used it on squirrels in his garden. He used it on paper targets in his backyard at 25 yards. He used it to teach Helen how to shoot back in 1976, and she had gotten good enough with it that she could reliably hit a Coke can at 30 yards from a seated rest, which was a better than average showing for a woman who had never touched a firearm before she met him. The rifle did not look like much. It looked like what it was, which was an old man's air rifle, but there are very specific things that an experienced shooter can do with a Springer in the hands of a trained marksman, and Earl Cutter had spent half a century learning those things. He walked back across the gravel lot with the rifle held loose in his right hand, muzzle down, the way a man carries a tool he has carried 1,000 times, and he approached the firing line from behind. Austin Krieg was still holding court. He had lowered his phone and was explaining to 2 other shooters why the Whisper was a flawed target design, his voice taking on the slightly defensive tone of a man who has just failed at something in public and needs to prove the failure was not his fault. Earl stopped about 6 feet behind him and cleared his throat politely, the way you clear your throat in a church. Austin turned around. He saw the old man in the windbreaker. He saw the air rifle, and because Austin Krieg was, in his heart, a decent young man who had not yet done enough hard living to have his arrogance properly sanded down, the first thing he did was grin. "Sir, respectfully, that is a pellet gun." Earl nodded once. "Yes, it is." Austin glanced at his friends, then back at Earl. "You want to shoot at the Whisper with that?" Earl nodded again. "If nobody minds. I'll only take 1 shot. Won't take long." Austin's grin got wider, the easy, uncomplicated grin of a young man who's about to get some tremendous free content for his next video. No, man, by all means. By all means. Take your shot, sir. The line is yours. Hey, Marcus, clear the line for the gentleman. Everybody off the bench, old-timer coming through." The other shooters cleared politely, smirking but not unkindly, and the small crowd that had been watching Austin struggle with the Whisper now shifted its attention to the old man in the faded windbreaker. Someone in the back of the crowd, a stocky older man in a grey flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on top of his head, had been turning his face slightly away from the firing line to speak to a friend, and at the sound of Earl's voice clearing his throat, the older man in the flannel turned back, and he saw Earl, and his mouth opened slightly, and his reading glasses slipped down off the top of his head and landed on the bridge of his nose, and he did not bother to push them back up because he had just recognized from a distance of 50 feet the last man he had ever expected to see standing on a civilian firing line in western North Carolina in the year of our Lord October, and his brain had temporarily stopped sending signals to the rest of his body. The older man in the flannel shirt was named Wilson Hayes, and he had been a command sergeant major in the United States Army before he retired in 2014, and in 1989 he had been a 22-year-old corporal attending the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, Georgia, and his lead instructor in that course had been a quiet, lean senior non-commissioned officer named Master Sergeant Earl Cutter, who had taught him 2 things that Wilson Hayes had spent the rest of his military career trying to live up to. The first thing was how to read wind off a piece of thread tied to a bush. The second thing was that the word impossible was a word that small men used to make their own failures sound like laws of physics. Wilson Hayes had not seen Earl Cutter in 36 years. Wilson Hayes stood very still at the back of the crowd now, and he did not say a single word, because he understood instantly and completely what was about to happen on that firing line, and he knew better than to interrupt it. Earl stepped up to the bench. He did not sit down. He was not going to need to. He set the butt of the air rifle against the inside of his right thigh for a second, while he adjusted the brim of his ball cap against the morning sun. He did not ask anybody for a rangefinder. He did not ask what the wind was doing. He did not look at the berm flag. He just stood there for about 4 seconds and looked at the whisper. The plate was swaying in a slow, shallow arc, the way plates sway when the wind has been working on them for about half an hour, and the chain has settled into its favourite frequency. The breeze coming across the range that morning was a left-to-right push of maybe 8 to 10 miles an hour, gusting a little, and Earl did not know the exact number because he did not need the exact number. He knew the shape of the wind the way a man who has spent 40 years reading wind knows the shape of wind, which is the way a farmer knows his own fields without ever having walked every row. He reached down and pinched a single blade of dry grass off the edge of the range deck and held it up between his thumb and forefinger for about half a second, and then let it fall. He watched the way it fell. He did the same thing again, with a different blade from a slightly different position. Then he shouldered the rifle. Austin Krieg had stopped grinning, because something in the way the old man was moving had started to land in his gut, the way the old man in the canvas jacket had started to land in Jesse Cade's gut in a gravel lot in Arizona 6 months earlier, though Austin Krieg would never know that story. Austin Krieg only knew that the old man in front of him was not moving the way he had expected an old man to move. The old man's breathing had slowed. The old man's shoulders had dropped about half an inch. The old man's cheek had settled into the walnut stock of that pellet rifle, with the automatic familiarity of a cheek that had rested on 1,000 rifle stocks before it. And the old man's finger had found the trigger in a way that made Austin Krieg suddenly, unreasonably, want to take 3 steps backward. The shot, when it came, did not sound like much. Air rifles never do. There was a muted, soft thump from the muzzle, almost inaudible under the ambient rifle noise from the other bays on the range, and for about 0.2 of a second nothing happened. And then the whisper rang. Not a big ring, not the clean, hearty clang of a big plate taking a centre mass hit from a proper rifle round. It was a small, thin, clear chime, like a tuning fork struck once and released, and the plate jumped visibly on its chain and then settled back into its slow sway as if nothing had happened. The crowd on the firing line did not react for about a full second. They did not react because they could not quite process what their ears had just told them. And then, one by one, they started turning their heads to look at each other, the way people look at each other after a magic trick when they know there was no magic but they cannot quite locate the seam. Austin Krieg took a step forward toward the bench, his mouth slightly open. Wait, did you... He raised his phone reflexively and pulled up the camera, zoomed it in toward the whisper, checking the plate for a smear. And there it was, a faint grey mark, the unmistakable lead smear of an air rifle pellet impact, about a half-inch below the dead centre of the 2-inch plate. A clean hit, on the swing, with a pellet gun, at 75 yards, in a gusting crosswind, on the first shot. Austin Krieg lowered his phone very slowly. The small crowd on the firing line had gone completely silent. Earl Cutter lowered the air rifle off his shoulder, exhaled once, set the butt of the rifle down on the range deck at his feet, and looked mildly at Austin, as if waiting to be told whether he had shot out of turn. And from the back of the crowd, in the clear, steady voice of a man who had spent 26 years telling large groups of soldiers what to do, Command Sergeant Major Wilson Hayes, United States Army, retired, said, "Well, I'll be damned. That's the second best shot I've ever seen that man make." And every head on the firing line turned to look at him. Wilson Hayes walked forward through the crowd slowly, because his knees were not what they used to be, and because he wanted to give himself a few more seconds to make sure his eyes were not lying to him. By the time he reached the firing line, Earl had already seen him and had already let out a small tired smile, the kind of smile a man gives an old friend he is genuinely happy to see, but is also mildly embarrassed to be seen by. Wilson stopped about 4 feet in front of Earl and looked him up and down the way a soldier looks at another soldier, and then Wilson Hayes, at the age of 57, came to a version of attention that his body had not executed in a decade, and he rendered a crisp civilian salute, and he said, in a voice just loud enough to carry to everyone on the line, "Master Sergeant Cutter, good morning, Master Sergeant. It is an absolute privilege." Earl returned the salute the way older men return salutes, with a small nod and a slight lift of the right hand that was more acknowledgement than protocol. "Sergeant Hayes," he said. "You don't need to call me Master Sergeant anymore, Wilson. We've both been retired a long time." Wilson dropped his hand, but did not drop the expression on his face. He turned his head slightly to look at Austin Krieg, and then at the small crowd of shooters around him, and he said, "Fellas, I don't know any of you, but I'm going to tell you exactly who this man is, because I do not want a single one of you to leave this range today without knowing whose presence you are standing in. Is that all right with you, Earl?" Earl shrugged, embarrassed. "Wilson, that's really not necessary." Wilson Hayes held up one hand. "Earl, with respect, it is necessary. It's necessary because the young man with the expensive rifle, who just pronounced that target impossible, is going to spend the rest of his life telling this story to other young men, and I want him to have the facts correct. Sit down, Earl, please, or stand if you want, but let me say this." And Earl, who had learned in his 28 years of military service that you could not stop a senior NCO who had decided to say something, just sighed and nodded and leaned the air rifle carefully against the side of the bench. Wilson Hayes turned to face the crowd. He took off his reading glasses and folded them and put them in his shirt pocket. "My name is Wilson Hayes. I retired 3 years ago as a Command Sergeant Major in the United States Army after 26 years of service, most of it in units you will not read about in a book and I will not name on a civilian firing line. In 1989, I was a corporal attending the Army's sniper school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The lead instructor of my course was the man standing in front of you now. Master Sergeant Earl Cutter, United States Army, retired. Some of you who follow this world closely may have read stories, in the years since the records of certain Vietnam-era long-range reconnaissance patrols have been partially declassified, about an unnamed Army sniper team that operated in the Central Highlands in 1971 and 1972 out of a forward operating base that no longer exists. Some of you may have read a particular account in a particular magazine about 10 years ago about a shot taken at 742 metres under conditions that several professional shooters at the time said could not have been made. The shot in that article was attributed to an anonymous source because the shooter who took it requested anonymity. That shooter is standing in front of you. This man, Earl Cutter. I taught the wind portion of the Army Sniper School for 6 years after my own time through the course, and every single thing I taught in those classes I learned from him. He taught me how to read a breeze by the way the hair on the back of my own forearm moved. He taught me how to shoot a rifle I had never seen before by putting it in my hands and saying the same sentence every time, which was, "The rifle already knows how to shoot, your job is to listen to it." And he taught me the one thing that I am going to say now in front of all of you, because I want the young man with the 280 Ackley to hear it the way I heard it in 1989, and I want him to carry it with him the way I have carried it ever since. Wilson turned slightly and looked directly at Austin Krieg. "The word impossible," he said, "is a word that small men use to make their own failures sound like laws of physics. That is a direct quote from Master Sergeant Cutter, delivered to my sniper class on the 3rd day of instruction, October of 1989. I have not forgotten it. I never will. And son, the next time you're tempted to use that word on a firing line, I want you to remember what you just saw an old man do with a pellet gun. Because the target was not impossible, you just did not know how to read it." Austin Krieg did not say anything. He was standing very still now, his expensive rifle hanging loose from its sling, his phone dark in his other hand. The crowd on the firing line was silent. Earl Cutter was staring at the ground with his hands in the pockets of his windbreaker, looking like a man who wanted very much to be somewhere else. Wilson Hayes stopped talking and waited, because he knew that Austin Krieg was a young man with more pride than sense, but not more pride than conscience, and he wanted to give the kid the space to do the right thing if the kid was going to do it. And after a long moment, Austin Krieg did the right thing. He handed his rifle off to the nearest friend without looking at him, and he walked around the end of the bench and he stopped about 3 feet in front of Earl Cutter, and he stuck out his right hand, and his voice when it came out was not the voice he used in his videos. It was smaller than that, and younger than that, and more honest than that. "Master Sergeant Cutter, sir, my name is Austin Krieg. I was a designated marksman with 2.5 in Helmand in 2019 and 2020. I have no business standing on the same firing line as you. I'm sorry, sir. I was running my mouth. I called a target impossible because I couldn't hit it, and that was stupid of me, and I said it in front of a crowd because I wanted to look good, and that was worse. Sir, if you'd let me, I'd like to shake your hand." Earl took his hands out of his pockets. He looked at the kid for a long second, and then he did something that surprised everyone on that firing line, including Wilson Hayes. Earl Cutter smiled a very small, very tired, very kind smile, and he took Austin's hand and shook it once firmly, and he said, "Son, I called a target impossible in front of a senior officer in 1971. He made me do it again, in front of the whole team, and I missed the first time, and I hit the second time, and the senior officer said to me, 'Cutter, you are going to be all right as a sniper, but only because you already know when you are wrong.' I have been trying to deserve that sentence ever since. You are going to be all right too. You already knew you were wrong. That is most of the work. The rest is just years." The rest of what happened at Ironwood Long Range that Saturday morning is the part of the story that Wilson Hayes would later describe to his own grandson as the most important thing he had ever watched happen on any firing line anywhere in his life. Earl Cutter did not leave. He was going to. He had wanted to. But Austin Krieg, still holding Earl's hand, asked him, in the kind of unguarded young voice that a man only uses when he has already been humbled past the point of pretending, whether Earl would stay for 10 minutes and show him what he had done wrong on the Whisper. And Earl Cutter, whose wife had been dead 11 months, and whose cabin in the Blue Ridge had been getting louder in its silence every single day since her funeral, looked at this big, sheepish young Marine in his expensive chassis rifle and his sponsored hat, and Earl heard Helen's voice in the back of his head say, very clearly, "Earl, honey, that boy needs 10 minutes of your time." And Earl Cutter nodded once and said, "All right, son, 10 minutes. Pick up your rifle." For the next hour and a half, Earl Cutter stood next to Austin Krieg at the firing line and taught him, in the same quiet, patient voice he had used in 1989 at Fort Benning, how to read the Whisper. He did not touch Austin's rifle. He did not reach for the scope. He just talked. He talked about how the plate was not one system but two, because the chain had its own pendulum and the wind had its own timing, and the trick was to stop trying to calculate the product of the two and start listening for the moment when they agreed with each other for about a quarter of a second at the extreme ends of the swing. He talked about how a shooter who's trying to beat a moving target with math is going to lose every time, because math cannot hold a rifle, and the rifle has to be held by a body, and a body has a rhythm that either fits the target's rhythm or doesn't. He talked about how the wind that morning was not a steady left-to-right push but a 3-part pulse, and once Austin learned to feel the pulse, he would stop needing to see the flag. Austin listened to every word. He missed his first 3 shots after Earl started talking. He hit his 4th. He hit his 6th. By the end of the hour and a half, he was hitting the Whisper 3 out of 5 times, which was better than any shooter had done on that plate since the range owner had put it up. And by the end of the hour and a half, Austin Krieg was not the same shooter he had been when the old man in the windbreaker had first cleared his throat behind him. When the lesson was finally over, Austin tried to give Earl money. He actually pulled out his wallet. Earl looked at the wallet, and then at Austin's face, and without any heat in his voice, he said, "Son, put that away before I get insulted. I did not teach you for money. I taught you because you needed to learn it, and because my wife would have been mad at me if I had walked away from you." Austin put the wallet away and asked, in a much quieter voice than before, if there was anything else he could do. Earl thought about it for a second, and then he reached down and picked up the old air rifle from where it was leaning against the bench, and he held it out to Austin in both hands. "Take this," he said. "I don't need 2 rifles at my age. This one's been waiting for a younger shooter to carry it for a while. I want it to be you. I want you to shoot it on your backyard target range every weekend for the next 20 years. And I want you to teach your own kids how to shoot with it someday, and when you get it out of the case to show it to your son or your daughter. I want you to tell them that an old man gave it to you on a Saturday morning at a range in North Carolina, and that old man taught you that the word impossible was the dumbest word in the English language when it came out of the mouth of a shooter. Can you promise me that?" Austin Krieg, 26 years old, former Marine Instagram shooter, took the wood-stocked German air rifle in both of his hands and held it the way you hold a sleeping baby, and he said, without any shake in his voice this time, "Yes, sir, I promise." And then he did something his 10-year-old self would have done and his 26-year-old self had mostly forgotten how to do. He hugged the old man, briefly, awkwardly, one-armed, because he was still holding the rifle. Earl Cutter froze for about half a second, the way men of his generation freeze when another man hugs them unexpectedly, and then he let his free hand come up and pat Austin once on the shoulder, and he said, "All right, son, all right. That's enough now. Wilson Hayes, standing about 10 feet away with his hand over his mouth, pretended to be looking at the range flag on the berm and was not fooling anybody in the small crowd still gathered behind them, including the range owner himself, who had walked out of the cabin office about 20 minutes earlier at the sound of the whisper ringing clean for the first time in months, and who had been standing in silence at the back of the line ever since, arms folded, watching the whole thing unfold and making a private decision that he was going to waive Earl Cutter's range fee for the rest of the man's natural life, and was going to put a small brass plaque on the bench at position 4 that simply read, in small letters, Master Sergeant E. Cutter, October, 1 shot. Earl Cutter drove home to his cabin in the Blue Ridge that afternoon, with an empty rifle rack in the bed of his Tacoma, and Helen's voice sitting quietly in the passenger seat of his head, the way it had been sitting there every afternoon for 11 months. The drive took him about 2 hours on 2-lane roads winding up into the hills, and for most of the drive he did not think about anything in particular. He watched the maples turning red on the ridges. He watched a red-tailed hawk sitting on a fence post outside of a little town he passed through without stopping. He thought about Austin Krieg's face when the whisper had rung. He thought about Wilson Hayes' salute. He thought about the first time he himself had hit a target he had been told was impossible, in a place that did not exist on any map, on an afternoon in October of 1971, under the eye of a senior officer who had later written a recommendation for him that Earl had never seen but had heard about. Most of all, he thought about Helen, and about how Helen would have laughed when he told her the story that night over dinner, and about how she would have said, "Earl, honey, you gave away the Diana, the one from Heidelberg," and Earl would have said, "I did, Helen," and Helen would have said, "Good, it was time," and Earl would have nodded, and she would have put her hand on top of his hand on the kitchen table, and that would have been the whole conversation. Earl pulled into his own gravel driveway just as the sun was starting to drop behind the ridge, and he sat in the truck for a minute before he got out, because his bad knee was stiff from the drive, and because he was not in a hurry anymore. When he finally stepped down out of the cab, the air up at his elevation was cold and clean, and smelled like wet leaves, and he stood there for a second looking at the cabin he had built with his own hands, and at the porch Helen had painted pale grey one spring, and he said out loud to nobody, "Good afternoon, sweetheart. I went to the range today. You would have laughed." And then he walked up the steps to the porch and opened his own front door and went inside, and for the first time in almost a year, the silence in the cabin did not sound empty to him. It just sounded quiet. There is a specific kind of lesson in a story like this one, and it is not the lesson about the impossible shot, and it is not the lesson about the cocky young sniper getting humbled in front of a crowd, although both of those lessons are real, and both of them are worth keeping. The lesson that matters the most is the one that Austin Krieg carried home with him that afternoon, and that he is still carrying today, because Austin Krieg has kept his promise. The old German air rifle lives in a case on the wall of his garage, and every Saturday morning Austin shoots it in his backyard, one slow, deliberate pellet at a time, at a 2-inch plate he had welded up by a friend and hung from a piece of chain at exactly 75 yards, and he has taught himself, in the 2 years since that morning at Ironwood, to hit it 5 times out of 5 on the swing, in almost any wind. He posts about it sometimes, not often. When he does not mention the old man. That is a private thing. But he has stopped using the word impossible in any of his videos, and he has started calling older shooters sir without an ironic inflection, and his subscriber count has not suffered for it. What Austin understands now, in a way that most men his age do not yet understand, is that the world is full of quiet old men who are walking around with skills that the rest of us cannot even measure, and that the only correct response when you encounter one of them is to shut up and pay attention. Earl Cutter still lives in his cabin up in the Blue Ridge. He is 76 years old now, a little slower than he was, but his eyes are still good and his hands are still steady, and on clear mornings he still steps out onto his own back porch with the cup of coffee Helen used to pour for him, and watches the mist come up off the valley. He does not go to public ranges anymore. He does not need to. He has said everything he needed to say on a firing line in front of a crowd, and he said it with a single pellet that cost less than a nickel, and the sound of it is still ringing in the memory of every man who was standing on that line that morning. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of the quiet old men in your own life, the fathers and the grandfathers and the uncles and the neighbours who never brag about what they did and never will, do one small thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button so more stories about men like Earl Cutter find their way to you when you need them. And in the comments below, leave one word, just one. Leave the words "one shot." 2 words, technically. Leave them for Earl. Leave them for every man who ever proved something impossible by doing it once, and then walking away without making a speech about it. They are still out there, and every so often, one of them clears his throat behind you on a firing line.